We are live.
Great. Welcome, everyone, to Connected Learning TV. This is the first webinar in our May 2016 series titled Building News Literacy, Critical Media Skills and Political Awareness Today, which was organized by the News Literacy Project. If you're watching this, please take a moment to share it with your networks. I'm Peter Adams. I'm SVP of Educational Programs at the News Literacy Project, and I will be your host today. And today I'm talking with Matea Gold and Abby Phillip, both national political reporters at the Washington Post, about how to assess and engage with national campaign coverage in this presidential election. And we will talk specifically about some of the challenges and opportunities posed by the range of election-related news and other information out there, such as rumors. And before we dive into our conversation, though, I want to go over a couple of quick details. To those watching live right now, we welcome your comments and questions through either the Twitter hashtags #ConnectedLearning or the numeral 2 NextPrez with a Z, or the Q&A feature that you should see within the video player in the Google Hangout. We'll do our best to address your questions here in the Hangout as they arise. This webinar is also being co-streamed at the National Writing Project's educatorinnovator.org site. And is part of a series of programming related to Letters to the Next President 2.0, which engages and connects young people ages 13 to 18 as they research, write, and make media to voice their opinions on issues that matter to them in the coming election, hence the hashtag 2NextPrez. So this webinar will be available as a resource on letters2president.org, where you can find many other resources and opportunities related to the election, writing, and digital literacies. And with that, I'd like to give our featured guests a chance to introduce themselves. Abby, do you want to start us off with a quick self-introduction?
Sure. My name is Abby Phillip. I'm a national political reporter. I cover Hillary Clinton and the 2016 presidential election. I started out as a reporter covering politics for Politico. I covered the White House in Barack Obama's I guess second and third years before his reelection, and then I moved to ABC News, and then I came to the Washington Post. So I've been covering Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders and a little bit of the Republicans, and now that we are getting closer to the general election, I'll be covering most likely Clinton going forward.
Great. Matea?
And my name is Matea Gold. I'm also a national political reporter here at the Post. My focus is on money in politics and campaign finance, super PACs, and billionaires. This is my 4th presidential campaign I've covered. I was previously with the LA Times and the Tribune Washington Bureau for 17 years.
Great. So before we get started, I do want to talk about your roles at the Post. I thought that we could look at a couple of examples of information about the election, and I'm going to try to share my screen here and share an example with everyone that we've sort of been discussing, Matea, that you shared with me. Let's see here. So a recent piece from the Washington Post actually yesterday about Trump associating Ted Cruz's father with JFK's assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, and making a claim about that. The interview clip is actually here, and I'm not sure if the audio will come through here. I guess we could have tried that out. Let me give it a play, and Matea, or Abby, you can tell me if this comes through for you. You getting audio?
No,
we're not.
Okay. Okay.
But we can describe a little bit about the story. And Abby, what I thought was so remarkable about this piece was it shows how a rumor gets into the bloodstream of this campaign faster than I think we've ever seen it.
Yeah.
This was a rumor that began on a blog that Rafael Cruz, the father of Ted Cruz, was somehow connected to the JFK assassination because he was seen, or someone who looked like him, the first blog said, who looked like him was seen handing out leaflets with Harvey Oswald in the days before the assassination. And then fast forward, and Trump brings this up on a national news program and has stood by it.
And I think normally in presidential campaigns, the candidate is the last person to air unfounded rumors, because most campaigns believe that the risk of that is simply too high. But this is not a normal campaign, and I think that we've seen so far that a lot of times that when we encounter rumors or unfounded accusations, they're coming directly from the candidate himself. And so it gets a lot of airtime, it gets spread much more quickly, and it gets responded to by, in this case, by Ted Cruz's campaign, who pretty vociferously denied it.
Right.
Although, I think by then it was a little too late.
Yeah,
Right?
it was the beginning of Ted Cruz's worst day in politics. By the end of the day, he had dropped out of the presidential race. But what was amazing was Trump was confronted with the source of his information being the National Enquirer, which sort of repurposed this blog, and questioned why he was attributing or citing the National Enquirer as a credible news source, and he stood by the Enquirer as a great news source and said something this morning, I think, like, no one should knock the Enquirer. So it's sort of unprecedented that you have now a presidential nominee citing a supermarket tabloid.
Right, so I have the original blog post up here in the share, and the image actually that is prompting this whole discussion is here in the center. And the assertion here is that this man, to Oswald's here, to his left, is Rafael Cruz, Ted Cruz's father, and then Matea, as you just said, the National Enquirer picked this up, and what Trump's comments were, I mean, the whole thing is ridiculous. What is this, right? Prior to his being shot, and nobody even brings it up. I mean, they don't even talk about it. That was reported, and nobody talks about it. So by just sort of omitting the source of the information and saying it was reported, he immediately moves on to sort of stir outrage that no one's talking about this and questioning why. And obviously on the show, no one sort of asked him where this information came from, and they didn't get into that conversation. But it's an important conversation to have. And this, in this particular election, is not at all unusual. We've got a couple of recent searches here for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump on Snopes, and the rumors, if you scroll through, if you go to Snopes and just search Hillary Clinton and search Donald Trump, 7 pages here of rumors about images that have been photoshopped, about images or old footage that is pulled out of context. Lots of rumors about Trump and doctored videos, things that he did or didn't say, often taken out of context or fabricated, and a lot of pieces from fake and satirical websites. So, Matea, Abby, how do you engage with these kinds of things? I mean, I'm sure these rumors come across your desk in the course of reporting on the election. How much of it are you seeing this time around, and what's your process when you confront these kinds of things?
Well, I see a lot of it, and as someone who covers the Democrats, much of it surrounds Hillary Clinton. Some of it has surrounded Bernie Sanders. There was one particular moment that comes to mind. There was a photo that showed Bernie Sanders, or someone who might have been Bernie Sanders, sitting in a sit-in demonstration at the University of Chicago around the time that he would have been in college there as a student. And the photo was being sent around as proof that he participated in the civil rights movement at the University of Chicago. And actually, you might be pulling up. Oh, right, there it is. And so there are a couple of tricky things with this. One is that Bernie Sanders' supporters presented this image as proof that he sort of had an affinity with the civil rights movement, with African Americans in the country. But there was also a dispute about whether that person was even Bernie Sanders to begin with. So when this image first came up, I think the first thing that we do as a reporter is we don't distribute images that we can't independently verify. And so, a lot of times people would tweet the image to me and say, here, this is proof that this is Bernie Sanders. And we would have to say, look, we just don't know. And there was a back and forth with the campaign. It turned out that the campaign really didn't know whether it was Bernie Sanders or not. They thought that it might have been him, but they could not independently verify it. And so we, as a news organization, on the news side at least, have not typically referred to this photo as evidence of anything. I mean, I think there is other evidence that Bernie Sanders was involved in protests to desegregate the University of Chicago, but this photo is not necessarily definitive proof, because there is a person who knew Sanders at that time who basically said, that's not him, that's someone else.
And then, Abby, did you get accusations from supporters of either Sanders or Hillary saying, why are you covering this up by not showing the photo?
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, those are the accusations on Twitter. People would say, why aren't you reporting this? Why aren't you publishing this photo? And you have to just say, look, if we can't verify it, if there's no proof, and if the campaign itself can't verify it, then it's even more difficult to prove it.
So I have to say, I have never covered a campaign in which the motives and the standards of the professional media have been so suspect in the eyes of our readers and viewers. So there is incredible disdain for, I think, the process of the quote-unquote mainstream media. There's a sense that we are, wedded to the establishment, and that we are playing favorites with information we share, we don't share, to your example, Abby. And then there's this sort of strange flat equalization that has happened where readers, increasingly those who are active on social media, equate every form of information as having the same amount of credibility. So when I was actually tweeting somewhat incredulously about the fact that the leading presidential candidate for the Republicans cited the National Enquirer as a news source, I actually was bombarded with tweets from Trump supporters saying the National Enquirer is more credible than the Washington Post. The Post is garbage, plenty of hate and spewing our way on that. So to me it's a sort of it's a staggering illustration of the challenge we face as journalists to try to cut through all of this noise and actually show that we have a vetted process to get information and why that matters.
And there's a little bit of a caveat in that these days a lot of information is being distributed on sort of user-generated platforms like Reddit. For progressives, the Daily Kos is a really big platform where people share information. Red State on the Republican side is very similar. And those platforms aren't always wrong, but they require verification. So even if information originates there, it's our job to sort of figure out whether there's any real supporting information, to seek comment and to seek verification from the people who might know. In a lot of cases, it's the campaigns or the candidates themselves, or the institutions that they might have been associated with. So it's not that we totally discount everything that we don't report ourselves, but when we do encounter them, we just have to, that Bernie Sanders photo was going around on Reddit for months, and it doesn't necessarily make it true. So.
Right. So I think there are two quick news literacy learning points we can make. And Matea, actually, you have a lesson featured on our new resource, the Checkology e-learning platform, about viral rumors, which teachers listening or students can check out at checkology.org. People rumors are designed to motivate people or to have some kind of emotional reaction that sometimes overrides rational thinking and sort of lets their own leanings influence how they view the information. So if there's a rumor that really resonates and they kind of hope is true, they're leaning into it, they might be more apt to share it with less critical judgment than a piece of information that they really hope is not true, in which case they might scrutinize it. So I think one answer to that is to be aware of that, and to, when you confront a piece of information, be aware of the emotional reaction you're having and try to surface that, and to sort of break out of that confirmation bias trap where you scrutinize things you hope aren't true, and you don't scrutinize things and maybe quickly share things you hope are true. The other quick piece of news literacy learning is that a lot of these rumors or an increasing number of them are originating on fake news or satirical news sites, which are basically, I think, clickbait engines, right? So they generate completely false but outrageous headlines that are intended to grab you and make you click. And just by clicking and landing on the page, you're driving up ad revenue for the site, and they're using that. And then those get shared, and people see headlines and sort of forget where they saw them, and they enter into the popular consciousness in a really pervasive way. So that's something I think students can take away here from that. So I want to come back to. Oh, go ahead if you.
Peter, I was just going to jump
Sure.
in. One of the things that strikes me with this situation with the rumor that Trump was perpetuating about Cruz's father is, I mean, embedded in this whole cycle of media that led to that rumor entering the media bloodstream was this perfect case study of how you can actually teach students how to avoid spreading rumors. Because one of the things I've talked to students about when you go into a classroom is to try to follow the practice a journalist does, which is to try to pull the string and go all the way back to the original source of information and figure out whether that original source is credible. And if you pull the string on the story and you go back to that original blog post, you see the blog posts, the sources they cite aren't even sources, they just use the word reportedly over and over again. So, I mean, that should be a warning flag for any, you know, high school student, much less a presidential candidate, who's looking to cite this as a credible story.
Yeah, absolutely. To drill down to the sources and look at the original source. And often you get into this sort of web of blog citing blog citing blog citing blog, and that string can get very long and very tricky to trace. Okay, so I want to come back to each of your roles. So you're both national political reporters at the Washington Post, but you do significantly different kinds of campaign coverage. So Matea, you cover money and influence. And Abby, you cover the campaign trail in large part in one particular campaign because it's hard to travel with more than one candidate at one time, obviously. So I wondered, Abby, if you have encountered people who don't really understand that you're assigned to the Clinton campaign and say, hey, you're only covering Clinton. Why do you only cover Clinton? Because if you pull your name up and, you know, if you search Abby Phillip in the Washington Post, it's all about Clinton. Do you get that from readers ever? Do people pretty much understand that that's your role that you're playing in a larger team of political reporters?
It's a little bit of both. I think there are a lot of people who do not understand that the world does not revolve around their candidate, their preferred candidate. So, so I think there's a lot of accusation of bias. If they're really fixated on you and they look at all the stories that you've written and they're like, you only write positive things about Hillary Clinton, or you only write about her, you never write about Bernie Sanders, which is actually really could not be farther from the truth for like the news organization. We have another reporter who covers him. We write a lot about Bernie Sanders. So, so people, yeah, I think people don't really understand that. I mean, I also encounter people don't understand the difference between news reporting and opinion, and that's a really important distinction online in particular, because I think, you know, as a news reporter, I cover things without telling my opinion, and I try not to take sides. I try to look at things from a relatively fair perspective, but sometimes I'm just reporting what's happening. And when I'm reporting what's happening, it doesn't always have another side because maybe the other side hasn't happened yet. So there's that, and then there's a lot of other things that are written on the Washington Post website that are opinions, and they express a person's point of view, and a lot of readers just may not like that and may associate those two things with each other and marry them together. So I get a lot of those that confusion from all kinds of people, both in person and online, on Twitter, on Facebook, and so on. So.
And with so much being shared, individual pieces being shared on social, you get a stream of hard news and opinion pieces in your feed in a way that in the print edition you don't, right? In the print edition, opinion is in one section, and so you know kind of where you are, what information zone you're in, as opposed to online.
Yeah, and I've been very surprised. This is actually something that has really surprised me, how little people are just not aware that there is a difference, and because a lot of news sites have become opinionated sites. And so there is at the Washington Post and at other newspapers like the Post a difference, and a lot of people are not familiar with it, but it's incredibly important because you can get upset about things that are just someone else's opinion that are not necessarily
Sure.
fact, and that's a huge problem.
Right. So, what is one challenge of your particular role in following a campaign and reporting on a campaign? If you had to talk about a challenge in that role as a journalist, what would it be?
Well, I think that it's, as a reporter these days, we are constantly, we're out with the candidate, and throughout the day we're filing stories. So it's not like I get home, at the end of the day I go back to my hotel room and I sit down and I think
Ponder the
about
day.
it and I just write a story that I really, I mean, maybe occasionally there's a longer story that I'm working on.
Sure.
But by and large, as things are happening, we are writing it in the moment and we're publishing it. And so the challenge is that we don't have a lot of opportunity to gather a ton of context. Sometimes, I mean, the benefit of being with one candidate all the time is that it's easy to grab context in the back of my brain because I've been following this person for so long and I know what they say all the time and I know the history. But sometimes there isn't the ability to kind of fact check or grab a bunch of background that you need to sort of tell a fuller picture of what's going on. And what that means is that sometimes you have to go back to it and you have to write another story or you update the original story. But sometimes, I mean, this is a really good case in point. If Donald Trump had said that at a press conference, every reporter in the room would have reported that this thing happened, and they would not have necessarily been.
I think we have a little bit of a connection problem here at the Post so far. Abby was talking about the challenges of reporting in real time on a campaign from the campaign trail. Of course, she's probably tweeting throughout the day about the Clinton campaign, following the Clinton campaign as her assigned role. And as she pointed out, she has colleagues covering the other campaigns as well, so that the Post has a balance. So often she has to file a short story and then come back later and add more context as it is available or as she's able to. And so I think one big news literacy takeaway there is that you have to follow coverage on an issue or on a candidate over time. So you can't judge coverage just based on one story. And I think we're going to get the folks at the Washington Post back here. They just dropped off, and they're going to come right back. We'll see what happened with their connection. So I think that what Abby was getting at really highlights an important news literacy lesson in that it's important for consumers to take a look at coverage and follow it over time to get the whole picture and to get the whole story, and not to judge the coverage of a news organization based on a single story. I think another challenge for Abby, and I'll ask her about it if she gets back, is this question of, oh, here we go. Wonderful.
Hi, sorry about that.
Hi, that's okay. I was just talking to everybody. So I was sort of saying that a big news literacy takeaway, in my view, from what you were talking about, is the need to follow a series of stories or stories about an issue or a candidate over time, so that not to look at one short piece by you on one day about Clinton and say this is the way the Clinton's being covered by the Post. I think people have this problem with positive and negative coverage as well. They see a positive story or hear a positive story or see one on television from one particular news outlet about a candidate, and they make a snap judgment about all coverage from that outlet on that candidate. And it's important, to get a full picture of coverage, and also to, as you mentioned, you might come back later and file a second story with more context as it becomes available.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And
Yeah.
I think one of the issues is that we can't always remind readers of our past coverage because we're moving so fast. I mean,
Right.
we try as much as
Right.
possible to embed in those stories and those references. But I mean, this campaign in particular has been so compressed that I have trouble sometimes remembering, this storyline actually started 3 months ago, and this is actually a key piece of information we need to give people. Everything is, I mean, happening in kind of greater intensity and saturation than we've seen in the past.
Right. So, Matea, following campaign finance and the influence of money, obviously has changed a lot in the last 5 or so years, and there are super PACs, and there are donors, and there are details about the amounts that each campaign has raised and what they're spending it on and how they're doing that. What's the biggest challenge in your role?
I think one of the things that is sort of the problem that I wrestle with on a daily basis, I guess it's twofold. One is that it's an incredibly arcane and technical part of politics, understanding campaign finance law, yet it's incredibly essential to understanding the mechanics of why things are working the way they are. So translating it into real English in a way that actually readers want to read about, not just that they can comprehend if they choose to. That's one challenge. The other challenge is that there's probably nothing more opaque about what's going on in the campaign than the fundraising, because it's all done behind closed doors, and there's often very little transparency from the candidates or the groups that are doing the fundraising about how it's working, who's participating, who's getting access to the candidates. And so my job is to sort of constantly try to push my way in places where I'm not always welcome, and hope that they'll let me back in the next time I try to do it as well. And so it presents its own obstacles as a reporter, but I do think it's rewarding, because once we're able to give our readers a window into that part of the process, I feel like they have a greater depth of understanding of what's actually occurring in the system and why candidates are reacting the way they are to things.
Right. Abby, I wanted to ask you about a possible other challenge before we move on, because I think it's going to come up in a bit. When you're covering a candidate, and it's sort of your job to cover Hillary and to cover her events and the things she says and the positions she's taking, but you have to, as a journalist, I guess, balance that against just magnifying her campaign messages, right? So obviously you're in touch with the campaign. They're giving you information. They're giving you her positions, which is important to get out to the public. But how do you avoid just publicizing Hillary's campaign platform? I mean, how do you make it reporting? Like, what role do you play to sort of flesh that out for the public?
That's a really good question, and I think it's also just there's no easy answer. It's just really hard. As a campaign reporter, I approach this as I'm observing a candidate and a campaign, and everything that they do, presumptively, is about strategy. And when it's not about strategy, we want to let people know that. So I think that what I try to do is let people know what's being said, but also tell them why. Tell them why they're going down this path. What's the point? What voters is she trying to reach? What problems does she potentially have? What problems does the campaign foresee in a particular state leading up to a primary or on a particular issue? And that's kind of that's sort of the connective tissue of everything that's happening. Is that I mean, I think every candidate's a little different in this respect, because not every candidate is operating with a grand plan in mind,
Sure.
and that's its own story.
Right.
When a candidate is not doing things that are in their best interest, or are doing things that seem off the cuff or impromptu or ill-advised, those are really interesting stories, because then we let people know, hey, this doesn't really work. This doesn't really fit with what the campaign says their plan is.
Right.
But when it is their plan, we say, going into, let's say, Indiana, which was this past Tuesday, her message was all about trade and all about the economy, and talking about it in a particular way. So whenever we wrote about that message, it was about the fact that the reason she's talking about it is because they were really worried that she was going to lose Indiana because she's had a really hard time reaching voters with her trade message. So that's really the core of what we do when we talk about a candidate's message. And we don't always write every day about what she's saying every single day. I try to write about it when we have something to say about it, when we're trying to make a point about what the strategy is or what her challenges are as a candidate.
Got it. So I want to switch gears to talk about a little bit about news judgment and how do you decide to write the reports you do and address the topics you do? And I guess for you, Abby, some of that is following the campaign and reporting on events and news statements and things like that from the campaign. But I know there are other stories that you get an idea to do, or you get a tip. And Matea, obviously, the same for you. How do you go about sort of choosing what to write about, which issues to take on, and of all the available stories to you, how do you decide which ones to actually report on?
Well, I think I'm lucky that I've been covering money and politics for 5 years now, and I think that once you've been on a beat for a while, it develops its own rhythm and organic narrative that you sort of intuitively see the next story coming. So I find that I just come up with a lot of story ideas just by talking to people and sources and asking what people are concerned about and what's preoccupying them, but also what they expect to happen. And there are moments in this campaign that's sort of a timeline that gives you natural turning points to write about. And so, for example, today we were writing about Donald Trump's pivot to the general election and how he would begin to fundraise for the first time after claiming he was going to self-fund his campaign. So that's obviously a natural story. But then, I mean, once you also are in the weeds in a topic like campaign finance, you start to see themes emerge. And one thing that I saw emerge really early in this cycle was this incredible boldness that candidates or would-be candidates were having with the groups, super PACs that were being set up to support them. Whereas in the past, there was a lot of wariness about too much interaction between candidates and super PACs that are technically not supposed to coordinate. I think the candidates and political operatives realized that, you know what, there's really very little enforcement in this area of the law. And so back in January, February, March 2015, I started seeing groups getting set up by friends of the candidates and allies, and it became very clear that this was going to be a dominant theme, that for the first time ever in a presidential campaign, nearly every single candidate was going to have a super PAC, and it was going to be run by a close friend or ally. And so those are the kinds of things I think if you've just been following a beat long enough, luckily you're able to sort of recognize when there's a shift or a change that really is remarkable. And then, I don't know, you just have to talk to as many smart people as you can, right? I mean, that's the best thing, I think, as a reporter, right? Have as many good sources as you can.
Right. Yeah, and I think that I would my answer is very similar to Matea's, which is that the only way, besides when you're on the campaign trail, sometimes you just have to cover what's physically in front of you.
Right.
But the other way is just to talk to people. Talk to people in the campaign, outside of the campaign. And even when you're covering things in front of you, you're still talking to people about what does this mean, or why was this said, or why is she going here? Why is she traveling to this part of the state or this part of the country? And that's how we talk to people about what they expect to happen in the future. We also talk to them about, particularly in this campaign, there's been a lot. This is Hillary Clinton's second run, so there's been a lot of retrospectives about, lessons learned from 2008 about how they are taking what happened to her in that last campaign and changing her behavior in this campaign. How has she changed as a candidate? How her supporters and her campaign apparatus changed around her. So there are a few genres of stories that come out of the campaign trail, but I think almost all of them are grounded in talking to people about their worries and their anticipations and their plans, and that's how we figure it out.
Great. And how much is social media? How do you use social in sourcing stories or in your reporting? How much of a tool is that for you?
So I do get story ideas from Twitter. from seeing kind of what's being chatted about in the world of campaign finance I follow a bunch of lawyers on Twitter and who tweet about very wonky legal issues that connect with the campaign. I do find also that, you know, occasionally some just readers will tweet or post something on Facebook that's just provocative, that makes me ask a question that I hadn't asked before. You know, unfortunately, the large majority of the interactions I have on Twitter, though, are with people who are just angry and who are just critical of the coverage, and not necessarily directed at me, but just directed at the establishment media. So I try to treat social media as sort of this wave that I dive into several times a day, but I try not to let it inundate me, because it's it can be incredibly toxic, I feel like, if you linger there too long.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really true. I think a lot of times when people interact with me on Twitter, it's not useful, but I do, I've sourced a lot of stories from looking at what people are actually talking about. Because, you know, campaigns and their candidates are responsive to the mood, both among sort of rank and file voters, but also among thought leaders and influential types who communicate with each other on social media. And through Twitter, we can see those conversations happening. And there have definitely been times when people have been talking about something that Hillary Clinton said or did, and that has become the story. The reaction to something that she said or did wasn't what the campaign intended, and it kind of backfired on them. And so those moments are stories. We can also divine the campaign strategy by what staffers are tweeting about. So if we all of a sudden see, you know, 6 former Obama campaign or former Obama administration officials who support Hillary Clinton all tweeting the same thing, that's a pretty good sign that there's a concerted effort to put out a message from Obama allies that this is what the Clinton, you know, this is what Clinton world wants. And those are stories too, and it's really important to kind of like pay attention to who those people are, follow them, and monitor the sort of prevailing sentiment among these people. Or if there is no prevailing sentiment, is there disagreement? You know, are people just on completely different sides of this? And I think that can be stories. Those can be stories too.
And hasn't there been some great moments on Twitter that are stories about the campaign's inability to use social media? There's some hashtag trends that they tried to start that backfired on them.
Yeah, this has happened so many times. I mean, there have been hashtags. I'm forgetting exactly which one it was.
Isn't there a grandmother one? The abuela.
Yeah,
they were trying
Hillary is not my abuela. They sort of put out this ad for. They put out an ad that was aimed at the Spanish language audience, and it did not go over well. And people were tweeting sort of jokes with "Hillary is not my abuela," basically saying, you know, you can't sort of just take on this culture and use it as your own. And there have been times when the campaign thought they were using a hashtag that was supportive of her, and it was taken over by people who are not supportive of her, because the hashtag was probably a little bit too generic. You know, there have been other hashtags that have been generated by protest forces, like Which Hillary is still a very popular hashtag that raises questions about her changing positions. So these conversations are ongoing.
Great. So we have a couple of questions from viewers. One came from Twitter asking, what advice do you have for teens in particular, for youth in particular, to sort out what's true and not in this election? And obviously, you know, we talked about the fact that this election has had a lot of assertions, has had a lot of sort of unusual kinds of misinformation and an enormous volume of it. What would be your tips if you could? I know it's a big question, but if you had a couple of tips you could offer to this questioner. You know, I would just remind students to think about your own emotional reactions and biases when you confront a piece of information, and be rational and be thorough. But Matea, Abby, do you have an idea for them?
Sure. I think one piece of advice I'd give young readers is the same one I'd give all readers, which is just to try to consume information from a multitude of sources. I mean, one of the things that concerns me in our trends of media consumption is that people are increasingly siloed and they're just reading what their friends are posting on their Facebook page. And lots of young people have actually told me this, sort of self-aware, that they realize they're just getting information that their friends are sharing with them. They're not necessarily seeking out new pieces of information from sources that might challenge their thinking. So, try to be Catholic with a small c about what you're consuming and where you're going for information.
Yeah, and a couple of just really simple things that I recognize add an extra step to consuming news, but I think it's really important to not embarrass yourself largely on the internet. And one of those is just take the subject, put it in Google, and generally speaking, if you will find corroborating information if it's something that's real. If it's something that is not real, or maybe there isn't enough information about it, you will find very little. And so that's a big, even when I consume gossip news, I'll just Google it and I'll see who's been writing about it. And if I don't see much, then I'm pretty certain that I don't want to go too close to it. And the other thing is kind of a simple thing, but I think it comes up a lot, is just look at the date and the time that something was published. So a lot of times, and recently this has happened a lot in the last year, people are resharing news that is not new.
Current.
That is old or outdated or maybe even inaccurate. And one simple way to avoid that is, even if you click on something, look at when it was published. Because if you're sharing something that's 20 years old, it's probably not what you think it is. That's a huge problem, especially on Facebook, where they don't actually, when you glance at a story on Facebook, they're not going to tell you when it was published. You have to click through to find that information.
Right. And obviously, if you Google something and only see blogs like the one we reviewed at the top that are thinly sourced and making claims that this is true, but no one else is covering it, that's language to watch out for as well, right? So we have another question that's related to our next topic. So I wonder if we could maybe talk a little bit about this next topic and then take the next question from the Q&A in the Hangout app. So we talked a little bit about Donald Trump. Abby, you said his campaign was a little bit unorthodox and unusual. He has made a number of really bold statements. He's an outspoken candidate. And he has advocated, building a wall on the southern border of the U.S. He has recommended killing the families of terrorists as a way to dissuade others from future acts of terrorism. He has advocated suspending access to visas for all Muslims. And these statements themselves are newsworthy, right? I think the press would be failing the public if they didn't report them. However, if he's able to create news every time he makes a bold statement, and he makes bold statements in order to create news, some argue, then that has the effect of giving him really broad coverage. So there are people who have criticized the media's role in really giving Trump a platform. And I wondered if you both had thoughts on this sort of catch-22 that the press is in. On the one hand, they have to be watchdogs and gatekeepers and let the public know what candidates are saying. On the other, when one candidate is saying a lot of bold things, they're going to get a lot of coverage. How do you sort of see this?
Well, I think that we have to. I think that when this campaign first started, I think we didn't realize it was going to be quite like this, where we would repeatedly be faced with information that isn't just maybe not true, but just completely untrue. I think that the turning point for the media and for myself personally was the moment that Trump suggested that he had seen Muslim people dancing in the streets of New Jersey.
9/11, yeah.
I think that was a really important moment in the campaign, because I think that it forced everyone in the media to become much more unequivocal about what is not true. And I think that a lot of times as political reporters, we give candidates a lot of leeway to say things, to have those things be fact checked. We give them a lot of times, I think, the benefit of the doubt. But that was a moment where that was a very clearly untrue statement, and it took a long time, probably longer than necessary, for people in the media to just say that and to just call it false. Right. And so, I mean, I think that this is new. We are in a kind of new place here where we have to kind of be much more clear about truth and falsehood, to be diligent about fact checking, to go back to original sources, to confront candidates about things that are untrue, and to insist that they reckon with the facts. And I think we're just getting to that point as journalists. I think this campaign has really changed that in a way that I just really don't recall us facing this kind of thing in the past. Not quite at this level.
And one thing that I think is important to note in this conversation, which I think is a really important one to have, I agree that the media has been irresponsible at times in the way that they've covered Trump. But I think it's also important to note that there's no sort of hierarchical top-down orders coming in media institutions about how to cover candidates. These are really broad, sprawling news organizations full of personalities, often most of whom operate independently. And so I think there needs to be some very tough internal scrutiny by news executives about the messages they're sending their staff about how they should be covering candidates like Trump, who do so often state things that are false as true and perpetuate rumors. I think it's also important for us to try to convey to readers that, you know, we as an individual reporter, as an individual journalist, this is our a philosophical approach to it. And so I think parts of, for the Post, for example, we've done just a superb job holding him accountable and holding all the candidates accountable for misstatements. And our Fact Checker blog is, I think, an exemplar of how to do that kind of accountability reporting. And I do think that across the media, including the Post, there have been attempts to ride on his wave of popularity and get clicks and views. So, you know, it's a hard conversation to have as sort of an individual journalist when you're trying to sort of muddle through this mess and make the best decisions in your coverage. But I do agree as an industry that media organizations need to start talking about it a little bit more.
Right, and that actually answered the question very well. The question was actually, how does this campaign and this election, how has it affected the way you view your work when it comes to fueling a particular campaign? So I think it was sort of loosely about Trump, but also other candidates. So just a quick follow-up, and then I want to get to advice for students in Q&A. Trump isn't the only candidate to sort of not take issue with news judgment, but to deal with that issue. So many of the 17 original candidates for the Republican nomination, as well as Bernie Sanders, have made quite a few statements about being ignored, being underplayed, undercovered, and that their poll numbers look the way they do because they're being undercovered. And then, you know, the flip side of that is, you know, that they're being covered appropriately for where they are in the race. So obviously, candidates who in the Republican field who were way down in the polls weren't getting as much coverage as the candidates, you know, higher in the polls, and it's a bit of a chicken and egg dilemma, right? Because coverage can help poll numbers and exposure, but journalists, I think, and news organizations have to make choices about which candidates to cover more, and front runners do tend to get more coverage. Do you think that's fair? That, you know, or I guess, what's the right approach for political reporters to play so that candidates are covered fairly, but also in a way that reflects the popularity of their campaigns among the public?
I'll just jump in quickly to say I actually don't buy the argument that news organizations have held back candidates in this cycle. Right. I mean, Sanders is a perfect example of that. He just won, what, his 17th primary? Right. He's outraised Hillary Clinton every month this year until this last month. I mean, there is an incredible array of choices of where to get information, and the Post has done exhaustive coverage of almost all these candidates. Right. In fact, we put some of the least likely candidates to succeed on the front page multiple days in a row. So I feel like that aspect of our democracy is working, is that people are responding to the candidates who have a message they connect with, right, Abby?
Yeah, and I also think that the way that the internet works is funny in the sense that you can seek out the information that you want to see, or you can see what is the dominant storyline,
Right.
so what most people are reading or talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think both things can be pretty misleading. They don't give you a good picture of what is actually being written about the world of politics. So I think people just need to be aware of that just because you're seeing a lot of stories about Marco Rubio
Right.
doesn't mean that those are the only stories that are being written. It might just mean that those are the stories that people in your circle are reading. And I think that that's frustrating for us because we do get accused all the time of kind of putting one person up or putting one person down. I mean, I often will get readers who say, why did you put this Hillary Clinton story near the top of the page, and then the story that has Bernie Sanders' name in it is in the middle of the page on the website? And I mean, sometimes there is a reason for that because there is news judgment that goes into where things are placed on the website, but it's not an attempt to suppress a candidate. It's probably more a reflection of either the organic interest in our website on a certain topic, or a reflection of the actual importance of a story. So it's not like the journalism or gods are sitting there saying we really don't want to talk about Bernie Sanders right now. Or we don't want to talk about John Kasich right now. It can be driven by a lot of other factors, and much of it, especially these days on the internet, is driven by traffic. It's driven by what people are actually reading and what people are actually interested in.
Right. And so just to drive that home for students, I mean, what we were talking about are assertions by campaigns about coverage, and obviously it's very popular to blame the media, which is such a vague entity. But that's very popular. It's popular at the debates. It gets applause at debates, and it is something that people love to do, as you both see in your social media feeds. And when a candidate does that, it can be an effective strategy. But I think it's important for students with political coverage and with all news coverage, when people make assertions about coverage, an issue or a person being ignored, to test that and actually go and look at coverage and make sure before you assume that.
Can I make one?
Sure.
Right, because you just reminded me. I also think that, I mean, we don't, as journalists, abdicate our responsibility to have judgment about what is important and what is not. And, I think a good example is when we're talking about the nominating process for both parties, and we talk about who actually has a chance based on the process, based on the map, to win this thing. And just because a candidate says they have a chance doesn't mean that they actually do. And it's our job to say so. And that might make people unhappy, but we can't. I think we're not, just because a candidate says something doesn't make it true. And as journalists, it's our responsibility to say that and to make judgment calls about what we cover and how much credence we give it on our platforms, based on our news judgment and based on facts, and not based on what people's preferences are and what their hopes and dreams are.
Right. So many of the students watching, some of the students watching, I should say, are students of the News Literacy Project and working on our units and might be interested in Letters to the Next President. But many of the students are involved with Letters to the Next President, which is an initiative in which they identify issues that matter to them and they create something about them, whether they write a blog post or they create a short multimedia piece or broadcast piece about that. So as journalists who research issues and topics all the time, what advice do you have for students who are trying to identify and research issues that matter to them, that have an impact on them, that maybe they feel need more attention? If you have quick tips.
Well, I mean, one thing I think we've seen in this news environment is that a poignantly described personal story can make a connection with a candidate, and they actually seek those out. And so, one is to write or research something from your heart that really matters to you. Get some facts about it, but tell a story in a compelling way. And I mean, there is an incredible ability now to communicate with, top elected officials and candidates through social media and Facebook and Twitter in a way that there never was before. So you actually have a much greater chance of having your voice heard by some of these people than you had in the past, which is pretty incredible if you think about it.
Yeah, and to that point, you can really communicate directly with candidates and their campaigns online in a lot of different ways. Many of the candidates this year have done Facebook chats, Reddit chats, Twitter chats,
Snapchats,
or you name it. I mean, the opportunities are really kind of endless at this point. And I've also seen just sort of average constituents, high school students, get candidates to come to their hometowns by launching social media campaigns, starting a hashtag, tweeting it repeatedly, building a following. That works. I've seen it work.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's about sharing a personal story, but sometimes it's also about demonstrating knowledge of a subject matter and a need. And connecting that with the interests of a particular candidate, and I think it works.
Yeah, and I mean, what's amazing too is I feel like what really connects in this environment, what tends to go viral, is things that clearly speak from the heart and are authentic, and authenticity is in really short supply in politics.
Yeah.
So the more you give a politician the opportunity to connect with an authentic story, the better chance you have that they're going to glom onto that.
Great. We do have a question from Twitter, and we welcome other questions here as we round out the hour. So we have a question about how do we talk to, or what advice would you have for people to talk to and teach young people about the so-called new, truth-free time in politics without making them cynical. So in an era when many citizens have this sort of attitude, like, you have your truth, I have mine, I don't trust anything but this source and that source, and often those are highly partisan sources of information. What tips do you have for talking to or working with young people to confront that reality but not make them cynical about the process or about the existence of credible information?
I'll just say personally what has heartened me and kept me from getting too cynical, and it has a direct connection to the News Literacy Project, which is several years ago when I was starting to feel sort of like the currency of what we were doing was being devalued. I started working with the News Literacy Project, going into schools and talking to students about how to identify the information that is credible out there. And just those like very concrete personal interactions with a group of 14-year-olds that changed their perspective on how to look for information heartened me. It made me feel like, all right, even if it's just in groups of 5 or 10 or 20, if I can really kind of communicate to people the value of what we do in journalism, I feel like if enough people do that, we will start actually creating a little bit of a change in our culture of how we view information. So for students, I think that is a kind of battle you can wage every day in your lives, and that's something that I encourage students to do, is that, your friend sends you a text and asks you to share it, and it's about a rumor going on in the school. Think twice about doing it. I mean, you've taken a stand at that moment for truth.
And I'll just say quickly, it's important to just point out when people are confronted with the truth, right? So it isn't, I would disagree that we're in a truth-free era, because people are being confronted with it. And I think that if you have an opportunity to show that, it has happened in debates, it has happened in town halls, it has happened online, at press conferences, through fact checks, people are confronted with things that are not true. And there are concrete times when it has changed their behavior. It's important to remember that those times have happened, they matter, they've made a big difference in this campaign, and they will continuing on.
Right, and I think for all the challenges that can drive cynicism, all the challenges about our new information ecosystem that's changing constantly, and for all the avenues for misinformation that are out there are a lot of opportunities and a lot of powerful ways to document what people have said and to go back to the record and actually establish truth in a particular context. And also, I think for people working with young people, The platform I mentioned earlier, the Checkology e-learning platform that the News Literacy Project just launched, which is at checkology.org, is a great resource, and you can actually pilot that at no cost right now. And if you're interested, teachers, just tweet at me or visit our site, and you can get more information there. So I think we are out of time exactly on my clock. Let's see. Oh, so Liana's saying that we can stay on here for a little bit here, and let me just remind viewers of a couple of things to close out. So we really want to thank Matea and Abby both, obviously, for a great conversation, and we are going to wrap up this first webinar for the month of May, and this series on building news literacy. We're going to have a second session later in the month. But please feel free to keep the conversation going on Twitter using the hashtags #ConnectedLearning and #ToNextPrez. And you can feel free to tweet at Abby, tweet at Matea, tweet at me. And there will also be a full video recording of this session available immediately following the session on connectedlearning.tv with other curated content on the way. And if you found this conversation helpful, please share it with your networks, and if you'd like to know more about upcoming webinars from Connected Learning TV, which is now produced by the National Writing Project's Educator Innovator, please visit educatorinnovator.org and sign up for the email newsletter. So I'd like to just thank everyone again for joining us here on the Hangout, and thank both Matea and Abby for joining me as well and taking time in what I know is a very busy time for you both.
No problem. Great to be with you.
Thank you. Okay.